Good morning, Madison Hills. You look good this morning. You feeling good? Yeah? Okay, good. You know, it's not one of the most common questions I get asked, but it is kind of a recurring theme. I get asked if I'm a Georgia fan. Does anybody else just randomly get asked if you're a Georgia fan? No? Well, it took me about 5 or 6 times of getting asked that question to make the connection. Oh, I get it. So I got a picture of the front of my car. You can see I took this pic, so it's not the best photograph, right? You can kind of see that big black blob right there. That's my phone where I'm snapping this pic at night. But I have a G there, and I assume that this is very similar to the G for Georgia. I don't know. I'm not a Georgia fan, right? So I don't know. So people ask me, and I'm like, it's green. And you really can't tell from this photo, but if you look at the front of my vehicle, it's green. I mean, what kind of Georgia fan would have a green G? Would you really do that if you're a Georgia fan? And I'm like, no. It's green. And my last name is Green. So it's just my way of saying, you know what, I'm owning it, owning who I am, owning the family. Green, putting that bad boy up there. I've had that license plate for several years, and I started this little slogan in my family called, you know what, we're the Greens, we're living green. That's it. We're living green. That's what we do. We start talking about stuff in our family, trying to create this intentional culture and this shared language, and that was just a good visual for me to do that. Now, time out with that for a second. Not a Georgia fan, okay? By the way, if you get anything from this sermon, not a Georgia fan. So some time ago, when I was a student at Johnson University in Knoxville, Tennessee, Michelle and I were living on campus, and we were in non-traditional housing. We lived in a duplex. And it's one of those deals where as soon as you walked into the duplex, you were like in the whole house, right? There's the living room, the kitchen, a hallway, a couple of bedrooms. You're just there. Well, I was a student, and I was loving everything. I fell in love with these professors. They were just super good people and just had a ton of content. Side note, I was a horrible student in high school, just didn't care, all of that stuff. But when I got to college and I locked in, I was like, where's this stuff been all my life? It's just great content. I love the dynamic. And I had one particular professor, Dr. Owens, and he was professor of the Old Testament. And this guy could teach, and he was so engaging and a super good guy. So I just fell in love with this guy. Couldn't wait to get to his classes, took a couple of them. Well, I come home one day and I walk into the duplex, and Michelle looks a little disheveled. And I'm like, hey, what's going on? And she's like, I don't know whether to tell you or not. And I'm like, okay, well, that's the cue to tell me, right? You have to tell me. And she's like, I'm just really upset. And I'm like, well, what's going on? She's like, I don't know if I can talk about it right now. So she takes a few moments to kind of get sorted, get clear in her own mind. She comes back to me and she's like, maybe I'll write a letter to the dean, or maybe I'll go talk to someone. I'm like, well, what is it? And she's like, well, I was coming out of the PW building the other day, and it's the building where all the professors' offices are located. And she said, I'm walking down the stairs, and I see these two guys. One is Dr. Owens, and another is one of your other favorite professors, and they're talking. And she said, they didn't see me, but I overheard the conversation. And they're talking a little bit about the student body, and then they talk about some of the things coming up. And then it switches, and she said, my mind just laser focused, just zoomed in on this. And I heard Dr. Owen say, and she's like almost in tears with this. This is very emotional for her. She says, David Green is awful. And she is just wrecked from this. And she's like, I'm going to write a letter. And I'm going to talk to someone. This isn't right. She said, you work hard. You do a good job. You love this guy. And for him to talk about you that way is just, it's pathetic. It's unacceptable. I'm like, okay, all right, do what you need to do. So a little time goes by. She actually reaches out to the professor, sets up a time to talk to him. They talk. Guess what? He's a Georgia fan. And apparently one of their players, named David Green, wasn't even talking about me. So talking about a different dynamic. Yeah, I think it's so cool that Michelle was able to have that moment where she felt like she needed to fight for her family. And I don't know about you, but it seems like there's this tension that goes on in a family. And it's this tension, it's not like tension that's like, oh, everybody's upset, but there's a tension between, I know I need to fight for my family, but sometimes it feels like I'm fighting in my family. So we're in this series called Insta Family, Snapshots of a Healthy Family. And we're not walking through some texts that are very laborious, but just some snapshots of some engagements and interactions that some families have in both the Old and New Testament and what we can learn learn from those. And there's a really neat story in the Old Testament, way back in Genesis, about a guy named Jacob and a gal named Rachel. And it's got some dysfunction in it. And if you've been around the Bible for a while, you know that their context and their culture is very different from how we do marriage and family in our context and our culture. And if you're new to the Bible and you're reading through this story, I would ask you one thing: overlook that this morning and focus on what we're talking about and the connections we're making. And then you and I can get coffee later and we can talk about all that other stuff that's going on and sort out some of the theology there. Is that okay? Okay, so you go way back when to Genesis, and it's chapters 29 and 30. And you've got this guy, Abraham, his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob. And Jacob comes on the scene and he's reconnecting with family. And he sees this gal and he falls in love with her, head over heels. And I know some of us guys don't like some sappy stuff, but this is a really, really sweet story. So this guy makes this connection and he's going to work to earn this girl's marriage, and she's going to be given to him, and there's one of those cultural differences. So just overlook that, suspend judgment on that for a moment, and just know that this guy is going to agree to work for 7 years so that this gal, Rachel, will become his wife. 7 years. And what we're going to see in these next 2 chapters is that there's tension with how this guy is going to fight for his family and get caught up with fighting in his family. And I hope we can walk away from this morning realizing that those moments where I'm feeling like I'm fighting in my family, I need to take a step back and say, okay, here's an opportunity where I can fight for my family, and what does this moment require of me? So he's going to work for 7 years, and the text says that he worked for these 7 years, but as years are going by, can you imagine year 2? And you've got 5 years to go before you can marry this gal. And then year 4, I mean, you're over halfway there, but come on, 3 more years of this blood, sweat, and tears working for this. I don't know about me, but I'm like, or Jacob, it's like, I don't know, is this really worth it? I mean, I don't even know the person yet. I haven't gotten into the mix, and I'm doing all this work up front, and that's a beautiful dynamic of the story, isn't it? He's doing a lot of work up front. And sometimes we get tossed into a marriage, or we go 1 year in, or 2 years in, or 4 years in, and we're like, put in a lot of hard work, but there's a lot of hard work to be done. How do I sort some of this stuff out? Well, the text says that he didn't feel the 7 years. It felt like a few days because he was so in love with her. Now, I know we don't like sappy stuff, right? But that is really sweet. The time just flies by because this guy is captivated by this gal. So 7 years passes, and the story goes on, and Jacob comes to this guy who's supposed to hand his daughter over, and he says, hey, give me my wife. My time is up. I'm done. It's 7 years in the books. Check it off. I'm ready to pursue my life with this gal. And when you read the text, you see that Rachel was apparently this beautiful gal, and Jacob is just head over heels in love with her. So it's like, yes, let's get this thing started. Well, the guy who's supposed to hand over Rachel has another daughter. So he has this big feast. They rallied around. It's like it's going to be a great celebration. And he actually brings his other daughter, Leah, into the scene. Yeah, you can see the problem, right? So Jacob wakes up the next morning and Rachel's not there. It's Leah who's there. So in this text, you can literally say from Jacob's perspective, and maybe this is where it hits home for you or for some of us who are in relationships right now. Rachel, from Jacob's perspective, was literally a totally different person once their relationship started in his mind. And relationships are hard, especially marriage. I mean, you get into it and you're in a year or a few years or 7 years and you realize, wait, you're such a different person. You're not the person I married. This isn't what we talked about. This isn't how we dated. What's going on here? And that's a really interesting part of the story. So time out for a second. I'm hung up on words. I like words right now, and I probably don't use them the best that I possibly can, but I'm just so engaged with words and their definitions right now. I heard this great podcast. And side note, Gen Z, I think, is responsible for this. I have some conversations with Gen Z, and one of the things that I'm so thankful about is the accountability they bring to different generations, because they are very technical. You know, I know that we got like no cap, Bet. But they're also very technical when you're talking about politics and social issues. And the conversations, if you really get involved with them, they funnel you down to a very precise wording. And it's very interesting and it's very beneficial as well. So it's one thing we can learn from them. But I heard this podcast several years ago, and there are these individuals talking about, I think they were zoologists, and they're talking about nature and all this stuff, and it was captivating. And they started talking about the words venomous and poisonous. Now, this is 3 years ago, okay, so don't judge me. Now, show of hands, don't tell me what it is, but just show of hands. Do you know what the difference is? Okay, about a quarter of us. 3 years ago, I didn't either. I would have used them interchangeably. I mean, those are the same thing, right? So I'm listening to this person talk, and it's a very professional individual with all these crazy cool degrees and all this stuff. And on the podcast, this individual says, well, here's the way we're talking about it. Here's how we're demonstrating the difference between venomous and poisonous. Venomous, and this is her language, she said, venomous is something that bites into you. And poisonous is something you bite into. I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. And for the next 3 years, I've been trying to work that into casual conversations just to show that I know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. Well, there's a couple of other words that are really important, one in particular, to this idea of family. And if you'll remember from last week, we're defining family not just as like a marriage relationship, but anyone who lives in your home. These are snapshots of a healthy family. So there's some dynamics here that we can apply to our marriages, or if you're dating, or to your children, or if if you're working on your engagement and so forth. So this is a really cool thing we're doing. Well, a couple of words that are applicable to family are expectations and anticipations. And do you know the difference between there? Again, don't answer out loud, but show of hands, do you know the difference? More of us know the difference between venomous and poisonous than these two words. Well, apparently anticipation is all about your thought. You think something is going to happen. And it could go either way, but you think it's likely that it may go this way, 51% chance. So it's all about how you're thinking about a situation. Expectation is a little deeper, and it's about belief. You believe this is going to occur. It's not dicey. There's not another option. This is really how you think it's going to play out. So your behavior matches that belief. It's interesting. Someone said expectations, they're an imagined reality that we project into the future. So again, going back to Jacob, I think it's interesting. He falls in love with this gal, and I bet it's exciting. And then 18 months in, what's he thinking about? And maybe it's not all bad. Maybe it's not all hard work. I mean, the text says the time flew by. So what's he projecting? What's he expecting? How is he playing this out in his mind? Because if he's doing that, and I think he does, because I assume you're like me. You're human. And this is what we do. And right now you're probably thinking of scenarios or a specific instance where you've done that with someone in your family or someone very important to you. You expect something from them. So it's not just you expect it. You start playing it out in your mind. You start imagining what that's going to look like. And they could be clueless. But you believe that's the way it's going to be and should be. So the text goes on. Jacob goes back to Laban. He sees what's happened here with Leah, and he was like, what is this? You ever been there in a relationship, especially with someone you're really close to? What's this? This is not what I signed up for. Is this really happening? What's going on? This happened to me, and I tell you, this can happen in subtle ways. This happened with me and Michelle, and it can be so subtle. Michelle, you want to step out? I'm just kidding. It's subtle, it's very subtle, but I think the subtlety shows how it can work in, and small things can turn into big things really quickly. Anybody eat yogurt? Well, this story's not going to work. Okay, all right. So we were on a yogurt kick several years ago. Big yogurt kick. Those Yoplays that are about this tall, and big like that. So I'm telling you, like 8 deep and 4 across in the fridge at all times, various flavors. We were just on this huge kick. The kids loved it, everything. So we're eating yogurt. I think Michelle said, "Hey, will you bring me a yogurt?" I'm like, "Well, sure. I don't mind to serve my lady like that." So I'm like, I go to the fridge and I get a yogurt, get her flavor, and I'm like, you know what? I can't just bring the yogurt, typical guy move. I need to get a napkin and a spoon too, right? To help her eat it. So I get the spoon, I pull the thing back, that little foil lid, rip that off. And then what do I do next? You stir it. You stir it. And I take it to Michelle and I hand it to her. And if I'm remembering this correctly, she says, and that's kind of a thing, have you ever been in a relationship and you do something for somebody and something's off, but they're not going to tell you. And I'm like, "Well, what's up?" She's like, "Oh, nothing." I'm like, "What's up? You did the She's like, "Okay, you stirred it." I'm like, "Of course. You're supposed to stir yogurt, right? You're supposed to stir yogurt." She was like, "No, you're not supposed to. And even fruit on the bottom of the cup, people don't stir." So I go to Christian and Sophie and Bella and check with everyone. "Hey, do you stir your yogurt?" And nobody in the family stirs the yogurt. And I'm like, "Are you kidding me? What is this? Are you kidding me?" Because in my mind, I know how this should operate. And it's those subtle ways that work into a family and work through a family. And you realize, I'm not fighting for you. I'm fighting against you. It's those subtle things. I think that's why Brene Brown, she takes it a step farther. She doesn't say expectations are just this projected, imagined reality. She says expectations are actually resentments just waiting to happen. That's powerful, isn't it? Well, a little time goes by, and Jacob, actually, I don't know if this is more of a guy move or a cultural issue at the time. So Jacob actually keeps Leah, and he agrees that if this guy will give him Rachel on the spot, then he'll work another 7 years. But he wants Rachel up front. And listening to that language again, suspend judgment with that cultural issue, and let's focus on what we're talking about, and we can talk about some of that cultural, theological stuff at a later time. So he's like, "Give me Rachel up front, and then I'll work another 7 years." So the dude must really love her, and he does. Now that's interesting to me. The guy does 2 7-year stints of work for this gal. And as you read the story, I'm thinking, year 8, how does this feel? Year 12, especially now that she's with you, is there any tension going on? So what happens is he keeps Leah as his wife, and Jacob and Leah actually have some children. And now children are brought into this dynamic. But Jacob, who loves Rachel, she doesn't have any children. So you flip the page in your Bible and you open up this story. So Rachel comes to Jacob and says, "Hey," she's so jealous, the text tells us, and she says to Jacob, "Give me children or I'm going to die." I don't think she's literally going to die. I think those are elevated emotions. And if your family's anything like my family, then we've realized that sometimes the communication that we have is an overflow of elevated emotions, but they're rooted in something. So when she says, "Give me children or I'm going to die," it's because she's jealous of what's going on. I don't want to explore jealousy too much because we're going to anchor it in a series that's coming up in October. And I think if we explore it then and really spend the whole morning talking about what jealousy is, it'll help a lot of us sort through some of this stuff with church and spirituality. But suffice it now to say, jealousy is not just that deal where you want something. It's not just somebody has something, you want it, or you see somebody succeeding or being successful, and you're like, "I'd like in on that," or "I wish that was part of my life." It's not just that. That's more like envy. Jealousy has a twist to it. Jealousy is where you already have something, and there's something else occurring that makes you feel threatened. There's a perceived threat based on what you already have, and that's jealousy. She's married to Jacob. They're going to be a 14-year deep relationship with all this work and toil. And then she sees Jacob with Leah, and she's having children. Well, she has this relationship, she has this setup, but she's jealous because it's a threat to what she has or what she wants to build upon with what she has. That's a really interesting dynamic. So I'm reading through this not too long ago, just getting some thoughts sorted here. And I'm also reading through this book called The Love Dare. Anybody familiar with that? I think it's 40 days, and it's like a devotional book for couples, and there's also one for children. And you read a brief devotion every day, and at the end, there's this challenge that you have. So I'm reading through, and I come to, day 5? Yeah, day 5. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, am I really going to take this dare? I read the devotional, I come to the challenge, and I'm like, whoo, this is a biggie. So I'm like, you know what? It's all right. I'm up for it. So I'm like, Michelle, I get in touch with her, and I'm like, today's love dare. I need you to do this for me. And her first question was like, is it okay to do this? And I'm like, well, sure. Here it is. Ask your spouse to tell you 3 things that cause him or her uncomfortable or cause him to be uncomfortable or irritated with you. And you got to tell them without attacking them or justifying your behavior. It's just from their perspective only. I'm like, I can do this. I can do this. So I'm like, hey, Michelle, 3 things about me that irritate you or make you uncomfortable. Now, I don't encourage rookies to do that. Okay? We got around 22 years under our belt, so we're up for it. We'll fight on the way home and sort it out. But rookies, don't go there. But that was the challenge. And she wrote 3 things, and I read them. And I'm like, okay, I've been doing that for years. That's not going to change. And I'm just kidding. I'm reading through. I'm like, okay, this is pretty good. We can do this. It's all right. And one of them she writes, and I'm like, oh, that's it. And there's a little bit of nothing great, juicy or anything like that, so don't get too excited or anything. But it's just this perceived threat going on. And I'm reading through it, and I'm like, this would be so easy for me to turn the table and attack her. And that's actually what she's asking me not to do. So Jacob hears Rachel, and I think it's an interesting dynamic, and maybe you've got an interesting dynamic in your family. He wants Rachel, he gets Leah, he keeps Leah, he has children with Leah. Now he and Rachel are fighting. And then he responds and he says, come on. And have you ever been there? You're part of this dynamic, you're at fault, but it's hard to vocalize where it went wrong with you or where you started tanking this. And he's like, am I in the place of God? I can't control this. I don't know what to do. What do you want from me? And so there's this ripple effect where emotions are elevated and communication is just an overflow of those elevated emotions. So a snapshot of a healthy family is getting those expectations in check so that you're communicating the right way with those in your family. So since children are involved in this, let me take just a note to say something about children. It's a really interesting dynamic going on that you fast forward into the New Testament, and there's some similarities here with passages like 1 Peter 3, Colossians 3, Ephesians 5 and 6, and some scholars, especially having one of those study Bibles, it's got like a half a page of the biblical text, then below there's some commentary notes. They'll probably refer to those passages as household codes. And it's how the husbands and the wives and the moms and the dads and the children, how they operate with each other. So just a point here about Ephesians 5 that we hit about couples pretty hard last week. The text goes on. And there's something really interesting. And I think I've observed this in family dynamics so often that I feel like I need to speak to it. And if it goes out and it falls into your life, allow the Holy Spirit to use that to build this culture, this healthy culture in your family. But the text starts out in Ephesians 6, hey, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is good or this is right. And if you know the text really well, you know that it also says that this is the first commandment with a promise. And if you obey your parents, then you're going to have long life on the earth and some things will go well with you because they've been there, done that, and they know how to guide and lead. And we teach that and we underscore it. Well, several years ago, I was looking at Christian's Bible and I turned to this passage right here and I noticed that it's highlighted and underlined. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was also with a blue ink pen, a box was around it. But it wasn't this verse, it was the next verse that says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. And it was just glaring on his page. So we had some really good conversations about it. But what I want to tell you is, I think I see that slip out of the picture in a lot of families. A lot of times you've got the authority, whoever the authority figure is in the family, and they are the one who is leading. And if there are children involved, the children should be obedient, and that's it. But the text goes on, and the children are to be obedient in the Lord. In other words, there's a way that we do things as followers of Jesus. There's a way we do things as people who make up the church. There's a way that we relate to our family. So children are obedient in the Lord. There's an understanding of this. There's a different dynamic occurring. And it extends to the authority figures in the home where they are not to exasperate or anger or irritate. And if you're anything like me, I probably hear you saying, yeah, but sometimes they need discipline, of course. Yeah, but sometimes they need to be put in check. Yes, I've got to lead them, of course. But the question is, how? How is this dynamic playing out? Or you step back and you ask the question, if my children are irritated or angry or exasperated, the question for the fathers or the authority figures in the home should be, why? And am I contributing to this in any way? With school starting back, the kids are getting into a different rhythm. I keep this out of the picture in the summers. It's just a different vibe, a different rhythm in summer, you know. So every Monday, when school kicks back in, every Monday I set apart a little bit of time in the afternoon, and I try to meet with each of the kids in the home, and I do a one-on-one with them. And they'll roll around. It'll be every Monday, beginning of the week, head on. And it's a time for them to just share. It's a time when they talk. And the prompt is simply this. Is there anything you feel or think that you need that we're not giving you? And then we just listen to what they perceive their needs and feelings or wants or desires or whatever for that week, whatever that is. That has worked wonders in our family. That communication, being on the same page, listening to the words they say, hearing them, hearing their stories, hearing their perspective, their perception of life and life in the home and what's going outside of the home with them. It's a great opportunity to connect with your children. So this idea of expectation and communication applies to everyone under your roof, your family. So here's what I want us to do ending this. I want to do a little love dare challenge with you, okay? Not day 5, okay? You don't have to do the 3 thing. And again, don't do that on the way home. You know, go have Mexican food and enjoy your evening. Don't get caught up in that chapter 5 deal, okay? But if there is a dynamic in your family that you need to work through, here's a couple of love dare prompts. And if you want to create some snapshots of a really healthy dynamic in your family, maybe love dare number 1 is for you. And here's the challenge. Say nothing negative about your partner for this coming week. Nothing negative. That means in your mind, to them, or to anyone else. Can you go a week? And by the laughter, I don't think you can. Try to go a week. Nothing. Do we need to go the afternoon? Go the afternoon. Nothing negative. Nothing negative. Number two. Change the way you greet your spouse. Here's what I mean by this. Several years ago, Michelle and I had this conversation, and I think it was on the phone, or she asked if we could have a conversation later because of a phone conversation. But we're talking, and she says, hey, I want to share something with you. I'm like, what is it? She was like, anytime I call you, the tone in your voice, it sounds like I'm in your way. And gosh, that hit me in the heart. She said, it sounds like I'm in your way. So for the next few days and few weeks, I started listening. I'm like, wow, I think I do have that tone. And I started changing, and I noticed that when I would call her, the very first thing she would say would be like, hey. So I'm like, you know what? That's the first step. So when she would call me, I started going, hey. And then over time, it became a little more natural and a little more fluid. And now I assume that when you call, I don't make you feel like you're in my way, do I? Okay, good deal. Number three, this is going to require some work, but I think it can move mountains in your family. And you'll have to identify, and maybe that's going to create some conversations for you in your family, both with whoever is in there, both ways here. But identify and then eliminate any unrealistic expectations. Ask yourself, are you running wild with some imagined reality that no one else in the family even knows about? Are you stirring everybody's yogurt? How are you expecting things, which is actually setting up your children to feel exasperated and irritated and angry? So what's the dynamic here? So we're spending some time working, fighting for our families. And if this has been some kind of trigger for you about more conversations or about what's going on in your life, and you want to continue the conversation, we've got a really cool thing coming up this fall that we're going to start promoting in a couple of weeks. And if you want to talk about a family dynamic, please reach out to me. Let me know. I think if there's anything that I could do as your pastor to serve you the best, would be to make sure we're talking about the family dynamic and doing everything we can to create that healthy family culture. So please reach out. God, you're good. We know that because of Jesus. And I pray that you use this series last week and this morning to reignite the right kind of fight that we have for our families. Not just fighting within, but fighting for the people that we do life with in our home. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for giving us the grace and the mercy and the guidance we need to make sure that we are making family the safest place that we'll ever live. God, we praise you in the name of your son, Jesus. Amen.